are again with an update on the x737. Flying over the beautiful Swiss Alps, not too far from the Zurich, actually Innsbruck airport. Let's get away from the noise here. In the cockpit here, I wanted to show you what I've been working on. Let me give you an update here. It's the pressurization. As I said last time, I worked on the pressurization panels, the pressure controller, and the gauges. I'll show you what I came up with. These two panels, as you can see. See, we're just leveling, the cabin's just leveling off at 29,000 feet. The way the pressurization works on the 737NG is there's actually two pressure controllers. They're identical, and when you're in auto, it will switch from one to the other between each flight. And if one should fail, you can get the auto fail light, which we saw previously, and the alternate light would come on, and that would tell you that it's in alternate and that the primary has failed. As I said, every flight they switch back and forth. Now, if we switch this to alternate, the alternate light comes on here. I kind of blocking it there with this, but you can see that comes on. If the auto fail light came on at the same time, you'd know that it had been a failure due to a system failure on the primary, and the alternate was taking over. The good news is they work identically, so as long as it's in alternate or auto, you have a pressure controller where all you really need to do is set the landing altitude and the flight altitude. With a knob, you can see we can set that flight altitude with that knob, of course, down here to 500-foot increments. Then you set a landing altitude for your landing elevation, and that's really all that happens. It'll actually won't pressurize the aircraft until you get some high on takeoff roll with a little power setting, a higher power setting. It'll start pressurizing the aircraft. So by the time you lift off, you get rid of that pressure bump. And that's all that's required. Now on the old classics, you had to flip an air-ground switch to start the process. You can notice there's a 0.125 psi differential max for on the ground. There's a good reason for that. You know how big the doors are, plug type doors. You open them inside and then they close back out against the opening in the aircraft, which is smaller than the door. So the door is kind of plugged in there by the pressure. That's why it's always a joke when passengers, they act like they're going to be able to open that door. Once you get any altitude at all, the pressure on that door, you figure that door's got several square feet, probably 3 square feet at least of area. So, you know, this 0.125 psi limit on the ground for takeoff and landing is so that if you had an emergency and you needed to open that door, you would be able to do that. That's the reason that we have that limitation, so that the door could be opened even if the aircraft was pressurized on the ground. If you got a much higher pressure, like I said, let's say it's 3 square feet, just as an estimate, that's 144 square inches times 3 square feet. So let's say you had 1 psi. If you had 1 psi, that'd be 144 times 3 times 1. So you can do the math. I mean, you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of pounds of pressure that you'd have to overcome. It's just frankly impossible. So that's the reason for that. Now, these gauges are pretty simple. If you look at them, you got the outer is the PSI. Right now we're at about 7 PSI differential. And the inner one shows you the cabin altitude. In this case, we're at about 5,200 feet cabin altitude. Down here we can see it's climbing at about 300 feet a minute, 300 to 400 feet a minute. There's a flight attendant's calling for some reason. I don't know why. I don't know why. So you can see the cabin is, I don't know, for some reason it's taking a little dive there, but the cabin rate is shown in feet per minute there. That shows you the cabin rate. Now the horn cutout here is just a button to cut out the horn should there be a if you get above the 10,000 feet cabin altitude, you get an intermittent horn. Sounds just like the gear horn, nee, 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 and this will silence that so you can hear yourself read the checklist. Now, there's also an alternate manual pressurization, and this gets a little dicey. I had this happen one time on a classic airplane, and basically what's happening, you see there's an outflow valve. You can see the outflow valve is almost full closed right now, which if we wanted to control this manually, we'd go to manual, and then we can control with the, see, I put closed. See how 4,000 feet a minute with that just tiny movement. It's extremely hard to control the cabin with that. You can't, just about can't do it. I had to do it one time for about an hour. As long as the power's consistent, you can have a little luck, but if the power's coming up and back, that bleed pressure is changing, it's really, really hard. Once you get leveled off at cruise, you can keep it fair, and you're not adjusting the power or the altitude, you can do it. But you can see, like right now, it's still 1,000 feet a minute. That's pretty hard on the ears. You're adjusting that, trying to control this cabin rate here. So that's a last resort, absolutely. And obviously alternate or auto would be much better. I'm not sure the actual airplane would have a similar, now I need to add a few things here. There, you notice when we had the high cabin rate there in the failure, we got the dashes there, and I don't have that programmed in yet. Still working on that. The other thing is there's a slight error. You notice I can easily adjust this here either way, okay? But this one is broken. For some reason, I'm going to have to contact Benedict, get this fixed, but hopefully he'll just, he can find a small error. But whenever I try to write a number into there, it'll, watch what'll happen up here. It'll go right to, if I try to do it up here, and I'm trying to write to the simulator, it goes right to 0 every time I put any value in there. So I can't really adjust it with that right now. Also, if you notice, if you select a negative value, mine's indicating correctly, but his is displacing over and it doesn't have the minus sign. So I told him about that too. So we'll get that straightened out, just some minor things to take care of, but you can see how that's going to work. So that's just an update on what I've done on the pressurization panel. It doesn't look like much, but the artwork took a little while, and this will all fit together with all the other instruments that we've made, and we're starting to get a pretty good start on a cockpit. So we'll see how that comes out. Anyway, that's all I have today. Oh, I'll tell you an interesting story. One time I took off from an airport on a very cold, almost freezing night with drizzle falling. It wasn't freezing drizzle, but it was a real heavy fog and low visibility. The temperature was just about freezing. It was a very, very cold area. We're going from Charlotte to Chicago O'Hare, and as we took off, everything was normal. We climbed out, we leveled off, and when we were descending down, they put us in a holding pattern at 10,000 feet. When we got there, I noticed the cabin pressure was about 40,000 feet. The differential was way up, probably about, I don't know, 7 or 8, I can't remember where it was, but it was pretty high. And we're in a holding pattern, and we noticed that. We said, what the heck's going on? And we tried adjusting things, and we couldn't adjust anything. We're a little concerned. It said 40,000 feet, but we knew we were at, like 10 or 12,000 feet. So we made this was on the Classic, but we made the mistake of going to manual. There's different power. The manual has a DC motor that has more torque. So we went there, and all of a sudden, as we went to manual, evidently climbing out, the outflow valve had frozen solid, and it had frozen closed. So we were able to maintain the flight. There's a couple outflow valves, but the main outflow valve had closed. So we started descending, and as we descended, the cabin pressure was increasing. And as we descended, the cabin altitude was staying pressurized because the outflow valve was closed. And as we descended, it didn't need the pressure. And the pressure, what happened really is the cabin altitude went through 0 and all the way back around to minus 40. So it was probably minus, I'm guessing it was probably minus about 5,000 feet or something like that. So when we finally did break that thing loose, instantly the cabin rate just went to max limit, and it was almost like an explosive decompression in the simulator. It was, when that air gets cold, when it gets depressurized, it gets cold all of a sudden. So you get this cold air and a little bit of fog from it in the cabin, and it was really, the flight attendants in those days, that was before we had locked cabins, they had keys to come in. and almost instantly I shot into the cabin saying, "What's going on? What's going on?" So we're not really sure. It took us a little while to figure this out. When we landed, maintenance, it was warmer on the ground. The maintenance did a test. They couldn't find anything, and we came to this conclusion that this had been our problem, is that the outflow valve had frozen. Only time I know I've ever heard of that happening, but that happened. So that's my little story about the pressurization panel today. Hope you'll check back soon. We'll keep working on these. I'll keep uploading panels as I get them done. Thanks for checking in.